I know there's a bunch of us that are recently discovering that we're Chinese.
I did a really big grocery haul today and decided to have some
If you hadn't heard, we're currently at a very Chinese time in our lives. Content creators across the Western Hemisphere have been proud to announce that they are now in fact Chinese to their social media followings after waking up and deciding to ditch their iced water in favour of the hot stuff on camera. Japan glazing has become too mainstream for the newly evolved performative male. He's ditched his matcha in favour of Tsingtao beer. He no longer has to hide the fact he can't actually roll a Golden Virginia cigarette with a tight filter, as he instead splutters on the dense petroleum fumes of China's finest Zhonghua Straits. He peruses the streets, hands behind his back like the Chinese uncles he's studied so carefully, a perfectly positioned glimpse of Mao's little red book peeking out from the pocket of his Adidas tongue jacket.
It is February 17th, which is the Chinese New Year. Here's everything not to do. I'm a woo-woo girly, and I'm telling you, don't do any of these things. Today's energy is very, very powerful. Listen.
My first doom scroll of the Year of the Fire Horse presented me with an array of white lifestyle and travel influencers freaking out on camera about having accidentally washed their hair and effectively their wealth away, and having thrown out their trash alongside their future prosperity.
You have to get the bin. I'm just telling you, you can't take the bins out tomorrow. Because it's the, I'm actually not joking. I just know you're going to think it's a load of shit.
A few swipes later, they were telling me my Chinese New Year do's and don'ts, which included not gambling and not wearing red over the next 5 days. I watched these videos from the streets of Taipei as I was lined up behind several aunties and uncles wearing 50 shades of red and about to burn £20 in horse-themed scratch cards. How could we have been so stupid and misinformed? Chinese people were never the cool Asians until now. I spent most of my formative years wishing I was either white, or at least Japanese or Korean. They had anime and K-pop. We had chicken feet, communism, and COVID-19. It goes without saying that I'm happy to see Chinese discourse being shared positively within the mainstream, but the way in which certain aspects of our culture have been picked, chosen, and packaged into digestible, profitable, and temporary social media trends for the Western world to cosplay makes me recall a time when the Western Hemisphere first experienced a very Chinese time in its life, 3 centuries ago and sans internet. As early as the 1500s, Western European merchants and explorers travelled across the globe to discover the mystic allure of the Far East, a civilization that appeared to operate entirely differently to the ways of the Eurocentric societal narrative. In 1557, the Portuguese established their presence in Macau, making it their gateway to trading with China and Japan. The Spanish, Dutch, and British soon followed suit, all wanting to get their hands on as much Chinese silk, silver, porcelain, and tea as possible. Their methods of doing this, not always ethical. By the 18th century, owning something Chinese, or Chinese-inspired, had become a status symbol for Europe's upper classes. You were cultured, forward-thinking, well-connected, and most importantly wealthy if you had a Chinese room in your house. This would be decorated with Chinese block-printed wallpaper, lined with hand-painted lacquered porcelain cabinets, and of course, laden with tea sets and highly expensive tea leaves. In Britain, this phenomenon arose due to King George III's fascination with all things Chinese. So much so that he sent British architects, scholars, and scientists out with trading companies to study the ways of the Chinese and bring back as many pieces of China as possible. London's Kew Gardens opened shortly after in 1759, housing hundreds of new species of flora clippings from China and the Western New World. In 1761, a giant Chinese pagoda was built on its grounds as a gift to its founder, Princess Augusta. In 1787, the Prince Regent, who would later be crowned King George IV, commissioned Brighton Pavilion, his newest Oriental holiday retreat. Its Middle Eastern-inspired onion-domed exteriors housed a bamboo-lined, lantern-lit Chinese pleasure palace, like no other of its time. The term chinoiserie was coined to describe this aesthetic, a European interpretation and imitation of Chinese and East Asian traditions, often found within architecture, literature, theatre and music, and associated with leisure and pleasure. But at the core of chinoiserie lay imitation, its essence constructed by what Europeans thought to be typical of Chinese culture, but not necessarily embodying anything similar to authentic Chineseness. Most objects found within the European Chinese room couldn't be found within a Chinese household. Instead, they fell within a category known as export goods. They may have been made in Chinese workshops, but were exclusively sold for Western consumption. The designs on these items often featured exotic birds, plants, insects, and even small Chinese people, again interpretations of what the Western eye perceived as inherently Chinese. Sometimes they weren't even made in China. The Chinese room was but a fabricated Oriental dream. It came neatly packaged for the European consumer to feel unique, educated and enlightened, without having to venture too far away from European familiarity and into the foreign world of otherness. That's why the social media trend of becoming Chinese feels like history repeating itself. Newly turned Chinese content creators recording themselves drinking hot water in their imitation Mandarin jackets and pretending to celebrate Chinese New Year feels like a virtual modern manifestation of the 18th century Chinese room. 3 centuries apart, there lies the same privilege in being socially rewarded for imitating superficial aspects of a foreign culture from a safe distance, the only difference being an evolution in social currency. The reward of appearing upper class, enlightened and wealthy is replaced with that of views, engagements and monetization. Palestinian-American scholar of post-colonial studies Edward Said coined the discourse of Orientalism to define this feeling. He defines Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient being the stage on which the whole East is confined. On this stage will appear the figures whose role it is to represent the larger whole from which they emanate. The Orient then seems to be not an unlimited extension beyond the familiar European world, but rather a closed field, a theatrical stage affixed to Europe. Within the confined theatrical stage of the imitation Chinese room, members of the 18th century European elite basked in rays of social validation as they enjoyed the privilege of being blissfully ignorant to the beginnings of unethical and exploitative practices upheld by the British Empire and East India Company in China. Practices that include intentionally and illegally fueling China's opium crisis to later invade the weakened nation twice, colonize Chinese land, and steal the very Chinese goods that stocked the cabinets of their Chinese rooms. Western propaganda would later blame the Chinese for the opium crisis, leaving Chinese people villainized and excluded from Western society. But for the European social elite, China would simply go out of fashion. Any notion of Chineseness quietly erased from the goods that were once staple showpieces within their Chinese rooms. Western content creators who have decided to become Chinese similarly dominate Chinese spaces from the comfort of the imitation Chinese room they've constructed within their phone screen. They have the privilege of accessing Chinese spaces by choice, speaking over, if not plagiarizing, Chinese voices, and superficially imitating aspects of Chinese culture, while remaining blissfully ignorant of the acts of violence, racism, and discrimination faced by Chinese people, sometimes in their very neighborhoods. Such uncomfortable experiences have no place within the confines of the theatrical Chinese room they have constructed, as they extend too far beyond the familiar Western lens from which they safely view the world. The shortening life cycle of social media trends, paired with today's geopolitical instability, means it's highly likely that China will go out of fashion again. Content creators will then let go of their tainted Chinese identities as they'll no longer provide any social or financial gain. They might continue to drink hot water as they found it helps their digestion or relieves their menstrual cramps, but will no longer advertise the practice to their followers as Chinese at the risk of harming their social credit. Real Chinese people will continue to be Chinese, they'll bear the consequences of appearing Chinese as Western narratives continue to dominate and restructure the way in which China is perceived. Chinese people in Western spaces lack the privilege of quietly erasing their otherness when it doesn't suit them. It's a pleasure to see non-Chinese content creators possess a genuine interest in Chinese culture and a willingness to learn that goes beyond drinking hot water on camera for clout. It's even better to see non-Chinese creators who participate in Chinese trends, taking the time to use their platforms to speak out against misinformation, stereotypes, and the treatment of Chinese migrants in their communities, among other acts of violence and discrimination. I'm still glad that you've found yourself at a very Chinese time in your life. There's so much to see and learn about our fascinating culture that I can't wait to share with you. But to become Chinese, that is, if you're truly interested in celebrating our traditions with us and practicing our values, you must first be willing to venture beyond the comfort of your Chinese room.